Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Museum of the African Diaspora. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the museum in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. As we begin all of our programs, we like to ground ourselves in the spaces we are occupying. As many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent, our institutions were founded upon the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose land we are located. MoAD occupies the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, and we pay our respects to the Ohlone peoples and their elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We encourage everyone to learn more about the native lands you occupy by visiting native-land.ca, and I'll put that information in the chat as well. I welcome you to our program series, African Diaspora Film Club, presented in partnership with Black Public Media, and today's program is also in collaboration with POV, the award-winning independent nonfiction film series on PBS. MoAD's African Diaspora Film Club features Cornelius Moore, who is a longtime director at California Newsreel, the 54-year-old social issue nonprofit film distribution and production company. He's also an independent film curator specializing in works from and about the Black world. Modeled after a book club, we expect that you will have already viewed the film today when you join us for the discussion. But if you haven't already seen it, that's fine. Just stick around and we'll try not to have any spoilers. Today, we'll discuss the documentary After Sherman with director Jon-Sesrie Goff. Jon-Sesrie Goff is a multidisciplinary artist, curator, and arts administrator with extensive experience in media and film production. He has offered his lens to a variety of projects spanning many genres, including the recently released and award-winning documentaries Out in the Night, Evolution of a Criminal, and Spit on the Broom, among several other projects. He studied sociology, economics, and theater at Morehouse College in Atlanta, completed his BA at the New School in New York City, along with an MFA from Duke University in experimental and documentary arts. John's work as an educator includes Duke University, Villanova University, and Westchester University. He recently joined the Foreign Foundation's Creativity and Free Expression team as a program officer of the Foundation's Just Films program. Previously, he was the executive director of the Flaherty Film Seminar and worked in the Office of Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. His personal practice has involved extensive institutional, community, and personal archival research, visual documentation, and oral history interviews in the Coastal South on the legacy of Black land ownership and Gullah Geechee heritage preservation. John engages with his work from the paradigm of a social change instigator. We'll start the discussion moderated by Cornelius, and we encourage everyone to participate by making comments and submitting questions through the chat or the Q&A box. And finally, please take a moment to type in where you're joining us from in the chat. We love finding the diaspora in our audience. Take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome, John. Thank you so much for joining us today and also for making that wonderful film After Sherman that I think viewers can appreciate in a lot of different levels on the history aspect and the artistic choices you made in presenting and organizing the film. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So just a personal note, I always love films. My family's from the South, from Virginia, both my parents, and I grew up in a community of Southern migrants, and so in the experience that I had and other people, I think in the neighborhood would be like, even though we grew up in the North, we spent a lot of time going to the South, going to down home, and what that experience was like, it's different for everybody. And so you're giving us this portrait of what it was for you.
Yeah, that's what I was definitely trying to tap into, sort of some of these shared experiences of us throughout the the Southern diaspora, the Southern Black diaspora. Yeah.
Mhm. So you finished the film in 2021, but when did you begin it? And so what were your initial intentions?
Sure. I started filming in 2014, and it was meant to be sort of an experiment, a survey of the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor. So I traveled from Wilmington, North Carolina, down to Jacksonville, Florida, or some people like to simplify it and say Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. But that's the extent of the corridor, 30 miles and from the sea, and then the barrier islands. So we traveled along the coast, stopping at some of the islands along the way in South Carolina and Georgia, and that was just really an attempt um, to sort of mark the territory with my camera, if you will, and then later I was going to find these stories and people to sort of animate the film.
Well, thank you for that, because North Carolina usually is not, well, at least for me, it's not usually considered in that. It's like it begins in South Carolina and Georgia and maybe Florida. So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
Thank you
no,
for
it
sharing.
was. I mean, I had been filming for almost a year, maybe 8 months before the shooting in Charleston happened, and that's what sort of changed the tone and direction of the film from what I had originally intended.
Did you have a particular audience in mind when you were making the film?
It shifted. It came in waves. Like, I think in the beginning, I joked that when I was sharing the idea with some of my family members, one remarked that this is quite possibly the least interesting thing I could make a film about. And so for me, it was both an opportunity to interrogate my family and community about the land and its history and some of the things that had gone unspoken. But as I was making it, I realized that part of the audience I had in mind were some of my friends that I grew up with in Connecticut and New York, where every time I would ask them, like, yeah, like, where are you from? Because the assumption was if you were not from the Caribbean, in the instance of my community in Connecticut, Jamaica, or Puerto Rico, that maybe you were from Connecticut, you know, and and it would always make me laugh because so much of my community was a transplant community from the South, and so yeah, I had in mind an audience of people who may not fully recall their Southern roots.
I love that section where you were in New York with your friends, and you all are talking about maybe moving to the South, or people's impressions of the South, or what they thought of the South. And I guess this was in New York, right? You were having a conversation. You know, New York is like people want to get out of New York, and there are more opportunities maybe in the South, and because of what's happened from the civil rights movement, changes the new South. But I just really love that interchange with people.
Yeah, me and a number of friends and students who attended college in the Atlanta University Center
Mm-hmm.
uh, around the same time, we staged a very silent revolt in which we marooned ourselves to New York, sort of in a silent protest to the ways in which we didn't feel like a liberal arts HBCU education at the time was progressive enough for those of us who had other experiences. And I have a friend who dubbed it the Afro Bougie Society. Like, so it wasn't sort of remaking the bourgeoisie ideologies of like the mid-century, the Jack and Jills and all that, the social clubs, but it was really, like we were a generation at the time when HBCUs were not the place to be. We all had opportunities elsewhere, but there was also a conscious decision on the part of our parents and elders to sort of install this very deep Black consciousness that you know, stories like um, Invisible Man and things like that were more or less nursery stories, you know, the people who could fly. And so like this idea of race being like very much seated and the Black arts movement being very present in our like, you know, early childhood.
And you make references to the Black literary works in the film. And so talk a little bit about like with Ralph Ellison and Langston Hughes.
Yeah,
Talk about that decision, please.
I mean, all the poets, like all the playwrights, Lorraine Hansberry, like these were people who sort of nurtured my early development. Langston Hughes being like many, you know, like one of the early literary figures that we sort of latch onto and claiming our Blackness and celebrating the Renaissance of Black artistry. And one poem in particular always stuck out to me, and it was a warning, you know, Negro, sweet, docile, kind, beware the day they change their mind. And so rather than using the first stanza, which is very overt, I used the second one. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me, but like, gentle breeze, beware of the gentle breeze that uproots trees, you know? And it's just speaking to sort of the volatile nature of peace, you know, within Black spaces. And that, you know, on the surface, while things may appear calm, you know, like anything could set it off. And that was sort of the awareness in which I made, you know, the majority of this film in the aftermath of the shooting in Charleston and the aftermath of many other things, Walter Scott and Mike Brown and many others.
So yeah, you dedicate the film to your mother, who you lost before the film was finished. So my condolences to you. She plays a central part in the film, as well as your father. And I'm noting that your father's voice is the thing I remember in the beginning. So please say more about why that decision. I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, so in the original version of the film, PBS had me amend it, but you know, I dedicated the film to my mother as the first producer of the film, and I wasn't speaking in allegory. You know, like when I decided I was going to make the film, and I started running into issues, sort of because I wasn't living in South Carolina at the time, and so trying to contact people by email and phone and people not quite being sure and being skeptical of my interest in heirs property, which was like my main interest at the time, Black land. And I had a Duke email address, and some people told me flat out, like, I thought you were a white man. You know, I'm like really tired of these large institutions coming to the region to extract our stories, and you know, and that was real. And so I had to call my mom, who, being the producer she is, you know, started making the connections. And she was the one who told me that if I wanted to make a film about heirs property and Gullah Geechee culture, that I had to work with Senator Pinckney, who was a pastor on their district and like a family friend. And so yeah, it was my mom and Reverend Pinckney who like really made the first introductions within the both political and cultural spaces for me to be able to start to make this film in an honest way.
And for people who don't know, Reverend Pinckney was among the people who was murdered at the church in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was the pastor at the time one of the 9 church members who was murdered, but also a state senator in South Carolina who had introduced legislation to both protect Black land ownership in the state, but also to preserve the cultural traditions of our region of the Gullah Geechee people, and had actually just delivered a very moving speech on the state Senate House floor in the aftermath of the shooting of Walter Scott in North Charleston by a police officer for better gun control legislation and better policing practices.
So curious how often you went back south. Was this an annual
In
thing?
life or in the film, in making the film?
No, I'm for both.
Yeah.
You can answer both. I was thinking just in life, but I'm curious in the film too.
Yeah, in life, I've officially been deemed a Southerner by many Southerners I respect, but I'd say there was not a Christmas holiday. I spent one Christmas growing up outside of South Carolina, you know. So imagine trying to explain to a young child Santa Claus when there's no snow, there's no chimney, you know. I'm like, there's no fireplace. I'm like, how's this gonna work? So what I was told was that he would come down the gas pipe. But didn't ask how that would work. But so yeah, every holiday, every summer I spent there. And then over the course of making the film, I was living between North Carolina and Washington, DC for the bulk of it. So I mean, every 2 weeks at times, I would find myself back home. And now, 10 years on, I don't get to go home as frequently as I would like, but yeah, but definitely home.
And thank you also for talking about the part of the origins about air property, because I think it's extremely important. I mean, we were both at the Black Star Film Festival a couple weeks ago, and there was a documentary about dealing with land and Black people, and particularly in the South, losing land and being swindled out of land, and the significance of air property. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, so that people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the ACLU called it like the largest crisis that we don't know about. I don't want to mess up the numbers, but millions of dollars are lost in terms of Black land ownership annually. And in the concentration of the Southeast, you know, it's quite exponential because we're talking about counties that at the time of the Civil War were 80, 85%, 90% African and or formerly enslaved folks. And so that's a lot of land, you know, because the people purchased the land after emancipation. It wasn't this big benevolent, you know, gift on behalf of the United States for past injustices. These were people who worked and ultimately purchased the land. But in the foresight, yet sort of lack of foresight, the foresight being if my heirs and my children and their children have land, they will always be counted as, you know, full citizens in this country. Let me make it so that the land belongs to all of us, you know, like there's no clean title essentially. And after a few generations, that's where the complications arise. And my family, and I've heard the story of other families too. My grandmother and her sisters legally divided their land in the 1940s. And so there's a layer of protection in that our heirs' property sort of restarted, you know, a century later or 80 years later, versus like it all still being jointly owned by all descendants of the original landowner. And with that, you know, the complications arise with the ability to develop the land, If you want to sell it, it requires, the sign off of every living heir. And, that could be hundreds of people spread all over the world. And, there are instances of people selling small carve outs within the middle of a family plot, and the buyers just not understanding what they're sort of getting into.
Yeah, I'll share my own experience. My mother's father actually in 1946 drew up a will and was clear about he wanted his daughters to have the particular amount of land, his youngest son to have the home place. So that was clear, and I was amazed that he did that. And my aunt, when doing one of my visits in the South, my aunt took me to the courthouse and showed me about all the land titles and everything. So that was great to know. On my father's side, there wasn't a will, and at some point people talked about selling. My oldest aunt, who lived to be 100, she was like, well, we're paying these taxes, let's do something with it. So I, did the contracted with a lawyer to do the title search and everything, and then everything went to me, and then once we sold it, everything went to the way it should have gone. We had to do a family tree. It's very complicated, as you indicate. Fortunately, there weren't a lot, if there weren't a lot of children, and who had interest in it. So, but it really is something. I'm glad you also mentioned how dire it is that people are losing land because of those issues you mentioned.
Yeah, I did a talk in South Carolina and in Columbia, and somebody pointed out during the talk, one of the panelists, like both at at sort of Port Royal, so Beaufort, and in Texas on Juneteenth, when the question was asked, "What do you want?" to the leaders of the formerly enslaved, in both places they said land, because it was very clear that this was a key to participating in this American system.
And also, I'm glad that you mentioned that it wasn't like a gift. That you remember that people actually, they did with their own agency. They wanted to have land and bought it, and how difficult that was doing that immediately after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, to do all that. So we give property props to our ancestors for having the foresight.
And seeing the clear economic reasons where the geographic regions were drawn up for Sherman's field orders. So my family's land is directly north of the Charleston County line, right? The land decreed was from Charleston south. The issue is that the wealthiest and largest plantations in South Carolina were in the county north of Charleston, Georgetown County. However, the planters all owned homes in Charleston. They had other plantations throughout the region. They owned homes in Barbados. I recently saw a document that listed a family member being sent to Barbados as property in the 1830s, but she was back in Charleston with her children, or with children, in the 1860s. And so this idea that people were always traversing the region is incredibly important to me personally. And the idea that like where the highest concentration of people were and what was considered the most prosperous lands were not deeded to the formerly enslaved. They were held by the planters, and subsequently they continue to be held by the American oligarchs.
So shifting to now, is you hoping, or is your film being used to raise that issue? About continuation of ownership of land and the threat of people coming in and trying to take things away, and if so, how?
Yeah,
How
I hope
is the film being used?
I mean, it's being used very, very directly in that way. It's being used as because so many people were involved in the production of it, like we have self-organized, outside of the construct of the film, and many different factions, from the artists involved to in making the film, of Gullah Geechee heritage or birthright, and to extended family members who I've become connected to as a result of this film, and wanting to preserve and protect communities and traditions throughout the region. So it's being used in that way for sure. But my hope is that it'll be used in the future to remind those who may forget, where their heritage. So, I mean, when I taught, when I would visit, even in South Carolina, I would often go in the summers to present at a vacation Bible school, and I would always ask, I would say, who here is Gullah Geechee, right? I'd be in like Hollywood, South Carolina, like literally in the heart of Gullah Geechee land, and no one would raise their hands, and I'm like, all of you, and so it's this idea that, like, the ways in which we are taught to not appreciate or celebrate our heritage because it may be considered less than. I think it's a generational thing that is happening, in which many people of the previous generation had an opportunity to assimilate in ways that elders did not. And so the very slight difference between my cousin Bunny, who was also very instrumental in making this film. She was a Gullah folklorist, a Gullah Uman, and established a museum in Georgetown and preserved a lot of artifacts from our family and community. She was in her 80s, early 80s. And so when I would film with her, she was like, yeah, I'm just a little older than your dad. But like, I got the Black readers, the Negro reader books in school. They had to read Dick and Jane, like there was a real shift in which people were intentionally assimilated in ways, told not to speak the language, not to speak the dialect. And so Bunny and others reclaimed that, like in the 70s. And as a result of that, a lot was retained, in a way that's like different than just remembering the way my grandmother spoke,
I was hoping that, well, I think I shared with you what my growing up was like, because there were people from all the coastal north, in the southeast in my neighborhood, and that what Geechee meant was rice. That folks ate rice for every meal, and nothing more than that. Not that, and I didn't really have conversations with people who were considered Geechee or anything, but it was like it was that simple and not anything else.
Yeah. I mean, I just recently learned the meaning of Geechee Dan. Like, I just thought it was like John Boy, but Dan being, an acronym for dumb, and so, like just the association that, like these were backwards people, largely because of their retained Africanisms, and the idea that anything that is too Black or too African is not good.
But the reality is everybody was from the country. It's like, oh, but the Geechees are another kind of country, so to make these weird distinctions,
Right.
that people would make. So, and the final thing I'll say about this subject, I was like, after Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, I assumed that there would be a shift about an appreciation and wanting to know more about the culture and appreciation of it. And perhaps that's, along with your film, that needs to be revisited so that people have a sense of that history?
Well, I think Julie Dash is the main reason why there's any interest in that history and culture. I think the the success and the beautiful articulation of her artwork, like really was instrumental into sustaining the imagination around Gullah Geechee culture. And certainly herself and artist, painter Jonathan Green are two people I cite as being, incredibly instructional in their practices, like just from observing them into how do you incorporate and celebrate this identity within your work.
So I want to shift a bit to talk about your process and of in your decisions, your artistic decisions in making the film, and that you decided on sort of a non-linear way of approaching the film. And question, is this Jon? Is that Jon does this is how Jon's vision is, or is it something particular to this film that you wanted to have that for this film? And I guess the thing is that bringing back also to people holding on and sharing a family history and culture, that 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 well, oral histories are a particular way. It's very structured and everything, and especially if we're going back and forth and you don't live there, and you're catching people as you can catch them, and they'll share with you what they'll share with you in the moment. So I'm curious how that influenced the non-linear way you approach the film.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. And then I also think and this is just me, like it's my first feature. I make very short pieces with the intention that, or my hope is that people can encounter it at any point and find an entry point to it, right? And so even with the quote at the beginning, I wasn't sure if that was supposed to be at the beginning or the end, but in my mind, it's all a loop. Like I experience these histories on loop, in each iteration we go a level deeper, we become conscious or aware of something else that, may have been there, but as we come over it again, we focus on something else. And so for me, the nonlinear aspect is that like, it is a loop. It could, I would hope that, someone could come in, 45 minutes in and be able to find some sort of entry point and have a curiosity to sit through the beginning, and the beginning isn't necessarily the beginning, the beginning is also the end. And so this sort of resignation that we are caught in this cycle as Black people, as Gullah Geechee people, in terms of claiming home, searching for home, being displaced from home, and I don't think that that's ending in my lifetime.
Well, your father talks about the distinction between birthplace and home place, and that's a key. That's a key element, I think, of your film, but also I think of being from the Southern diaspora, that happens over and over.
Absolutely. I think being part of any diaspora, it happens over and over.
Talk about the significance of water in your use of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's both the Bruce Lee quote, which I love, like, oh, you put water into a cup, it becomes a cup, and I think that's a lot about Blackness, and at least how I've experienced my Blackness, especially globally. It's like you put me in Cuba, I become Cuban. You put me in Colombia, I become Colombian. You put me in South Africa, I become South African. And that's quite interesting for someone who only speaks English. I don't really speak English well. So it's like, I'm always fascinated. I call it like my Black Pass, my global Black Pass is that like, I have been able to experience and see things that, your average tourist could not, simply because of my Blackness. That it's because of colonialism and the diaspora that, we retain so much phenotypically in common with, folks all around the world.
Well, your father mentions also the flow to the Atlantic to the African continent.
Literal.
So you're a preacher's kid, and there's a lot. There's going to be a lot shared with you, and sermons and the like. So and intellectualism that theologians have. I mean, it's like it's stamped of approval, where other people may not have that, or So, do you have something to say about that experience of being the son of a preacher, a theologian?
Yes, a preacher and a theologian. I think the theologian part is important because I'm not sure every preacher gives their child a signed copy of Black theology, like as a Christmas gift. But so James Cone, was both influential to, I think, my father's theology, but also to my understanding of the role of Christianity in a radical Black space. Like I'm of the Jesus and the Disinherited Howard Thurman ilk of Black theology. And so, yeah, that is something I cannot escape. And I call the cinema my temple and the place where I go, to seek the absolute and to find community and to celebrate and praise and worship all of humanity.
That's great. That's a great quote about your philosophy.
Yeah.
And when watching the film, there's some things I want to ask you questions about. There was a scene where you have I think it's a home movie of you in the church speaking,
Yeah.
and it's in filmmaking, independent filmmakers. It's also very rare that Black folks have that they can integrate into their work. But that was you, right? Talking.
That was me. That's the only home movie that exists of me as a child. And there's a scene of me like at a school play or recital or something. It was all the same day. So literally my parents rented this camera to record the school play. And as a result, I have this one recorded memory. And it is ironic because we recorded every Sunday service. So there were definitely cameras around, but it wasn't turned on like our personal lives or yeah.
But the recordings of the service, do they still exist?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That's where I learned filmmaking, working with the AV department. And when they switched from just audio recordings to video recordings, I went to the very, very first training at our community television station. and that was my entry point to both camera operation and offline editing.
There you go again. There's another very, very important thing that you just said, because I don't think people think about the church, how central the institution is, and how people learn things there, and the skills that people get, and inspiration they get.
I tell people all the time, I mean, one, I always had a computer in my home and a typewriter, word processor, because my mother was the first graphic designer I knew. She made every program for church bulletin like as long as I could remember, and I saw the whole evolution from working with clip art and Xeroxing to like finally having print shop on our Apple IIgs to, you know, getting our first compact. And like, it was a tool. Like, well, my parents also had a newspaper at one point. And so I saw like how folks would come together to print, you know, like newsprint newspaper. And so all of this interaction with the tools of media, but for the purpose of community, were like ingrained and available and demonstrated, you know, to me.
And also, thank you for mentioning Xerox, because that's an important part of the film too, your father's activism.
Yeah, yeah, the deep irony in it all. I did shoot on Kodak film. I had thought about shooting on Fuji film as a political statement, but it I we colored it to look like Fuji film with the blues and the greens. But yeah, Rochester, New York at the time was considered the imaging capital of the world. It was home to the international headquarters to Kodak, to Xerox, and to Bausch and Lomb, and Wegmans and Tops and a few other companies. And needless to say, like those Black folks who had migrated there in the 50s and 60s had been, you know, severely underpaid and mistreated for decades. And so when my dad arrived there, you know, that's where the majority of, you know, our community were working. And so he, you know, he had no choice but to sort of address that injustice.
And also, I just remember as during anti-apartheid activism that there were employees, and I think I get this right. Employees there were leading to put pressure on Xerox, because Xerox was, no, that's Kodak. No, is it Kodak?
Yeah,
No,
I think it
Xerox.
was Kodak.
Oh, Kodak. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But I'm sure Xerox was used in under apartheid South Africa too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The other artistic choice, there were scenes where you have people talking, and you know, all about their, you know, personal history and where they came from in the region. And also, there's a man in the, I think a relative of yours, in the kitchen talking about you know, sharing his story too. But you decided to have imagery in the back of them, and I'm curious what that was about.
We had a lot of animations that we had to pull out. I mean, it's I still don't know if I have an opportunity to make a second film, so I had to put it all in this one. But really the idea that like there's something operating at another level, another dimension than like what we're experiencing in this physical reality, and how can that be represented? And so through my film, we did it with animation, but you know, I had been obsessed with the physicality of rabbit tobacco, or life everlasting, as it's called, in the community for a very long time. And so, but it's so small. Like, how do you see that? Like, how does that become like a visual thing on a screen in a cinema? And so that's part of the reason why I I allowed a lot of those elements to creep in. Same thing with the rice dancing across, you know, the landscape in one scene. It's saying it's here, like look, like being very, you know, obvious about it, but also hopefully accessing something on a different sort of register than like what could be done just through, you know, traditional video capture.
And you mentioned Fuji, wanting to shoot on Fuji. I remember, and this could be wrong too, that Fuji was, I mean, they, in the 60s or 70s, they were because of who they were shooting, Japanese people, that they, you know, that for people's skin tones, that you know, that was something that they were promoting, or at least saying that was a quality that they had, that other film stock didn't have. And the response from the entertainment industry here was, well, that's not interesting to us because we don't use those people in our film. So
Yeah.
that's something you had thought about too, or you
Oh
knew
yeah,
about?
the test models for Kodak back in the day. I forget the name of the cards, but like the idea that everything was calibrated to a white woman, you know. But yeah, yeah. On many many levels, I was having my own cackle at sort of the fact that the only film stock available for me through B&H was Kodak.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got a question. We got a couple questions. One was someone who wants to be in touch with you, and I think we can share that with you through Elizabeth can send you that information. But from Joyce Muse, she's always wanted to attend a true Gullah festival. When and where are they located?
There's only one true one that I know. I'm sure there's many, but Heritage Days at the Penn Center on St. Helena's outside of Beaufort, South Carolina is considered to be sort of the most authentic Gullah-led, Gullah Geechee-led celebration, annual celebration. So the Penn Center was established before the end of emancipation as a part of the Port Royal experiment to see if the formerly enslaved could self-govern and if they could become civilized. And so those grounds are very sacred. And after emancipation, it became a school within the community, a boarding school, later a community center, and then in the 1980s, it became a cultural center, which it exists as today. But in the 60s, prior to King's assassination, it's where he would also retreat and where a lot of the SNCC training would take place. So much so that they were building a cabin for him at the time of his assassination, and it's left sort of in the period furniture and everything as it was intended for him to come and take residence.
So was that also where Miss September Clark was too for the
September Clark, they did some of the Freedom Schools trainings there too, but she was more up in the Charleston area.
Let me ask there's another question. I think he has only scratched the surface of the Black Southern life. Does he intend to carry this theme into other documents? Do you?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I hope to. I hope to have the opportunity to do it, even in my smaller works. You know, I think I'm constantly looping and circling around these questions. Like I'm developing a piece based upon some not widely accepted research by a archaeologist who excavated a site on the plantation where my family came from, but on Cat Island, South Carolina. But what they suggest has captured my imagination. It's just about archaeological evidence of rituals, you know, within the sort of buildings on this island.
And I forgot to ask you, this is an important aspect of your film and doing the timing. When the massacre happened at the AME church, did your film must have taken a turn? So I'd like to know, and I think people in the audience would like to know what that was about, what that was like.
Yeah, it took a huge turn. I mean, me and my now wife, we were living in Durham, North Carolina at the time, so about 4 hours away, and literally drove down first thing in the morning to be with my parents. No understanding of like the magnitude that this was going to be, but also keenly aware that the shooter had not been apprehended. And so as we're driving, you know, at night to Charleston, you know, from North Carolina, like looking at every car, like Is it you? Is it you? And then arriving and one being overwhelmed by the media presence. Like I think the circus isn't even the most accurate word. It's just like absurdity is a better word. But yeah, so the national media descends, and so I had to make a choice with my little camera who I was going to be in that moment of the aftermath. And although I had press credentials, White House press credentials, I chose to be a son and a community member. And so that means that everything I documented was literally from the side of my mother or father, and not from the vantage point that the rest of the press had access to, you know. And then also not recording, like recognizing that this is a moment that even though no one else had access to, it may not need to be documented to the extent that I'm capable and skilled of documenting it. And so that became sort of the biggest personal test to like learn when to record and when to not record, when to show up with a full crew, or full meaning, you know, two other people, or, you know, like when to have my stripped down camera. And I think yeah, that was the biggest impact of the shooting, and having the discernment as to what stories get transmitted, because also having deeper access to most people who reported on it, like I just knew what was happening because I was there. And I decided that wasn't the film I ultimately wanted to make.
That's really important, and it's very special, and that people people from the outside wouldn't necessarily, probably wouldn't show that respect. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I still haven't brought myself to listen to all the FOIA material, you know, because the Freedom of Information Act. So I have all the 911 calls and police reports, and it's, yeah, I think it's different when, you know, it's people, you know, intimately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There, you get praise from someone who says she's, you know, from the California, and so didn't have a relationship with the Atlantic, but your father's words had opened my eyes to the sacredness of the Atlantic because it connects us back to Africa. Thank you. Someone else asked about the difference between Gullah and Geechee.
It depends on who you ask. So I grew up only with the term Geechee, and in the 90s, Gullah became the more accepted, widely used term for the culture in the region. And so different people have different answers. You know, some people say the mainland people are Gullah and the island people are Geechee, or, but it's really not. There's no true distinction. It's subjective, and so that's why often when it's spoken about today, and from a cultural standpoint, it's Gullah Geechee. So they can be used interchangeably. But yeah, some people say Gullah is a language because it's close to being like a derivative of Angola, but it's very subjective.
To the Angola languages.
Well, the majority of the slaves that came to the region were from Angola or Senegambia region, the rice growing cultures.
Okay. The film, for people who have not seen it yet, I mean, share with us how people can watch it. They can, if they're a PBS member of the local station, they can watch it to Passport for a couple more months.
Correct.
You know, how else could they see it?
It's also available on Tubi, streaming now, and I believe if you're interested in it for any educational purposes, our distributor, Cargo Films, is the appropriate contact.
And Elizabeth put that in the chat, so that's great. There's also a survey from Black public media, and I think POV for people, for specifically this film, that would be helpful for people to fill out in the chat. Let me see what else here. Yeah, there we go. And the response from people in the area who've seen the film, or where you've organized screenings, what has been the response?
There was one demographic in particular that I was concerned about, and it's our elders. And this is me in my Zora Neale Hurston lane. You know, she used to say the way she would learn a song of a community is she would practice it over and over and sing it back to the elders until they told her she got it right. You know, not until then would she take it out into the world, you know. And so, yeah, this is a song that my elders sang to me, and I sung it back to them, and they told me I got it right. So that's the most rewarding feeling in the world.
That's beautiful, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's true. Jim Felder is one of the people, he's a civil rights icon in the state, who came to one of the screenings, and yeah, it meant the world to me. Yeah.
And there's the Gullah diaspora too. You know, all well, I guess up and down, certainly up and down the East Coast.
Oh yeah, everywhere. I mean, my cousin Bunny used to say, "How do you think people got to Texas?" You know, where they come from. And it's true. Like I've traced family, you know, on the Trail of Tears from the coast. So yeah.
On the Trail of Tears.
Oh yeah.
Oh. Okay.
Oh yeah. The Gullah diaspora, because in our cosmology began in 1526. You know, and so it goes both across the country, you know, with the expansion of America, but it also is throughout the Caribbean. There's Gullah Geechee communities in Mexico, because there were soldiers given land after the Spanish-American War who identify as being descendants of Black Americans, you know, and there's communities in Asheville, North Carolina, you know, that still have retentions of coastal Carolina identity. And so, yeah, the diaspora is quite large.
So we're almost at time. It went by fast.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure that people have an opportunity to ask the final question of John. And I hope I didn't miss anything. I think I got all the questions. And Elizabeth, if I didn't, please help me out. Let me know.
I think you got them all, Cornelius.
Okay.
I didn't see any extras today.
And while Elizabeth's searching, do you have any final words for us, John?
I'm just grateful for an opportunity to be in conversation with you, Cornelius. So thank you, Elizabeth, for organizing this. And yeah, it's exciting, and it's exciting because I don't think it's one film or one story that ever turns the tide to things, but I do appreciate the visibility that I've had through the journey of this film, and I'm hoping that, along with many other works and many other types of works, that, you know, both the memory of our elders are preserved, but also a celebration of our shared cultural identities, no matter how we define them, can become more cemented.
Yes, thank you. That dialogue is extremely important and urgent.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to your next works. And thank you for After Sherman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for this very rich and layered conversation, and for your incredibly wonderful film, John. Thank you. I want to make sure everyone checks out MoAD's website to learn about our next film club program in October. It'll be coming up on our website soon. I want to thank our sponsors, Black Public Media and POV PBS, for today's program. If you are in the Bay Area or planning to travel here, you should come see us at MoAD in San Francisco. We actually just closed our current exhibitions today, and we won't reopen with new exhibitions until September 27th. We're looking forward to featuring the artist Joe Sam, as well as a group show called Spectrum on color and contemporary art. And we always have our emerging artist program as well. And we look forward to more film programs with Cornelius. And thank you so much again, Jon-Sesrie, for joining us.
Thank John.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.